No one who lived in the shadow of the Wyoming range ever forgot what a real storm felt like. But tonight, even by those wild standards, the thunder was unrelenting, rolling in sheets across the high prairie, rattling Dr. Grace Whitaker's old Chevy as she sped down the muddy county road. The headlights barely cut through the downpour. She cursed under her breath. If the phone call had been any less urgent, she'd have waited out the weather. But when a neighbor begged for help with a calving cow, Grace just couldn't say no. She'd always answered when the wild called. That's what made her a good veterinarian in these parts. But tonight, as the wind howled and the wipers fought to keep up, it felt more like fate was pushing her than duty. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment, she thought she saw movement along the fence line, a pale shimmer against the dark, something limping, then falling. Was it a deer? She squinted, heart hammering, and swerved to avoid a massive puddle that nearly swept the truck into the ditch. The flash of lightning was almost blinding. In its glare, Grace saw her, a wild Mustang mare, legs tangled and bloodied in barbed wire, body heaving with each breath. The mare tried to rise, stumbled, and fell again. Grace's breath caught. She knew this Mustang. Luna, the same ghostly gray who sometimes led a small band at the edge of her property, always just out of reach, a legend in the local coffee shops, no time to waste. Grace pulled over, boots sinking into the churned-up mud as she grabbed her emergency kit. Rain lashed at her face, soaking through her coat. Each step was a fight against the wind. The mare's eyes rolled white, nostrils flared. Any closer and Grace risked a panicked kick, but if she didn't move fast, the wild horse would bleed out, or worse, break a leg thrashing. "Easy, girl. I'm here to help," Grace called, her voice barely a whisper in the roar of the storm. She inched forward, hands open, keeping her body low. Luna's flanks shuddered, but she didn't bolt. Instead, the mare let out a sound, half pain, half warning, that made Grace's heart ache. She saw now the full extent of the tangle. Barbed wire sliced deep into Luna's hind legs, and blood mixed with rainwater, streaming down. But there was something else. Luna's sides were distended, heaving, and as another flash of lightning revealed, her body trembled with more than just pain. She was in labor. For a split second, time stopped. The storm, the mud, the cold, all faded as Grace's brain snapped into gear. Luna's foal was coming, and if she didn't act now, both would be lost. She reached for her wire cutters, hands shaking. Luna's ears flattened, hooves thumping dangerously close. One wrong move, and she could end up with a broken rib, or worse. But there was no turning back. "Hang on, girl. Just a little more," Grace whispered, inching closer. Each snip of the wire felt like a race against the storm. The rain stung her eyes, blurring the world into streaks of gray and red. Mud sucked at her knees as she crouched beside the Mustang, carefully looping a halter over Luna's neck, just in case. The wire gave way, and with a wild cry, Luna lurched to her feet, only to stagger and collapse again, foam flecking her lips. Her eyes were wild with terror and pain, but she didn't fight Grace off. That's when Grace saw the foal's feet protruding, slick and motionless. The delivery was all wrong. The foal was stuck. Grace's mind raced through every field emergency she'd handled, but nothing matched this. She swallowed, adrenaline mixing with fear. The mare would not survive much longer. The foal had less time still. She took a deep breath and slid her hands along Luna's trembling flank. The Mustang's body tensed, muscles clenching in agony. Grace gritted her teeth, ignoring the ache in her knees, and reached in, careful, methodical, working by feel as much as by sight. The foal's shoulders were caught. Another roll of thunder crashed so close it rattled Grace's bones. Luna kicked, but Grace held steady. Come on, come on. Stay with me, Grace murmured, barely aware of her own voice. Rainwater soaked her hair, ran down her neck. Her hands slipped, blood mixing with mud. But finally, the foal slid free, limp and blue in the lightning's afterglow. It wasn't breathing. Grace's world shrank to that tiny, fragile body in her arms. No thinking, only action. She cleared the foal's mouth, rubbed its chest, and breathed mouth to nose, desperate. Thunder cracked again, closer than ever. Luna stood over her, sides heaving, torn between the urge to flee and something like hope. The foal's chest heaved, a gasp, then another, weak but alive. Grace laughed and sobbed at once, the sound snatched away by the wind. Luna nosed her baby, trembling and battered, but did not run. Instead, she stood watch over Grace, eyes wild but grateful, wildness and gratitude warring in her stare. Grace slumped to the ground, cradling the foal, heart pounding as the storm raged on. Tonight, the wild had called, and Grace had answered, not knowing it would change her life forever. The rain only grew harder, turning the prairie into a sheet of moving water. Grace blinked through it, her whole body aching from adrenaline and strain. The little foal, so fragile, lay gasping in her lap, its sides fluttering with each shallow breath. For a moment, Grace almost believed it wouldn't survive another minute out here in the open, but she refused to give in to fear. She wiped mud from the foal's nostrils with her sleeve, murmuring words she barely remembered from childhood. Half prayer, half promise. Luna hovered close, her sides still heaving, head lowered to nose her baby. Grace was careful not to startle the wild mare, though every instinct told her Luna could bolt at any moment. But the storm had penned them in, its fury so fierce that even a Mustang knew the safest place was close to the only human she'd ever half-trusted. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the chaos of the landscape. The ruined fence, the tire tracks half-flooded already, the glint of blood on Grace's hands. For a heartbeat, everything seemed suspended. Luna stood with trembling legs, her body battered but her spirit fierce. She stared at Grace, wildness and desperation mixing in her eyes. The foal shuddered, letting out a thin, broken sound. Grace's breath caught. She forced herself to move. Every second counted. Carefully, she ran her hands along the foal, checking for injuries. Its heartbeat was there. Weak, fluttering, but there. She had to get both horses somewhere safe, out of the wind and water, before shock set in and took them both. But how could she convince a wild mare to follow? How could she move a newborn through this storm? She searched her kit for the emergency IV, usually reserved for dogs or calves, but it would do in a pinch. As she fumbled with the tubing, hands slippery with rain, her mind replayed every emergency barn call she'd ever made. None had ever felt so desperate. She managed to find a vein in the foal's spindly leg, started a slow drip of warmed saline, and prayed it would help. Suddenly, Luna let out a shrill, distressed whinny. Grace's heart lurched. In the rain, headlights appeared. Another truck crawling down the road, its beams slicing the darkness. Was it a neighbor? Trouble? She pressed herself against Luna, trying to shield both mare and foal with her body. The truck stopped just yards away, engine idling. The window rolled down, and a familiar voice cut through the storm. "Grace, you out there?" It was Tom Garcia, a ranch hand from down the valley. Relief surged through her. Tom leapt out, holding a flashlight, his hat already soaked. Over here! I need help! Grace shouted, waving. Tom's eyes widened as he saw the scene. Barbed wire, wild Mustang, muddy vet kneeling over a foal. Lord, you know how to pick your nights, he muttered. But he didn't hesitate. Together they worked fast. Grace handed him the saline bag, told him to hold it above the foal, and started fashioning a makeshift sling from an old horse blanket she kept in her truck. We'll have to move fast, she said, voice hoarse. We can't leave them out here. Tom nodded. Can she walk? We'll have to hope, Grace replied, glancing at Luna. The mare watched, nostrils flaring. The only thing keeping her from bolting was her foal and maybe Grace's familiar scent. Lightning flashed, thunder booming so close it made both humans jump. Grace slid her arms under the foal, cradling it as gently as she could. The colt was limp but alive. She motioned Tom to walk slowly back to the truck, calling softly to Luna. Come on, girl, come on. The mare hesitated, every muscle tensed, ready to run. Then she took a halting step forward, ears pinned, eyes rolling. Grace held her breath. Another step, then another. The storm had become an unlikely ally. Its noise drowned out everything but the desperate need to survive. They reached the truck, Tom opening the back, while Grace gently placed the foal on a bed of blankets. Luna circled, agitated, but didn't run. Instead, she kept close, as if tethered by invisible thread. Grace spoke softly, coaxing her with gentle words. Tom jumped in the driver's seat. You get in with them. I'll drive slow. Grace climbed into the back, her arms around the foal. Luna squeezed in after them, shivering, muscles twitching from exhaustion and fear. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the mud, but Tom kept them steady. Inside, Grace worked by flashlight, checking the foal's breathing, monitoring Luna's wounds. The storm rattled the roof, wind shrieking through every crack. Grace felt time stretch and collapse. She stroked Luna's neck, whispered to the foal, every sense alive to the fragile line between life and death. At one point, the foal's breaths grew shallower. Grace's heart seized. She began mouth-to-nose breaths again, willing life into the tiny body. Don't quit on me now, she murmured. Luna pressed her nose to Grace's shoulder, then to her baby, as if urging both to fight. Finally, the foal let out a stronger cry, chest rising and falling in time with the storm's rhythm. Grace wept, silent tears mingling with rain and sweat. For a moment, nothing else mattered. The ride to the barn felt endless, every bump jarring, every shadow a threat. When they finally arrived, Tom helped Grace carry the foal inside, Luna following on trembling legs. Grace's hands never left the colt, not for a second. Inside, the barn was a sanctuary of warmth and light. Grace cleaned Luna's wounds, set up a gentle IV for the foal, and wrapped them both in blankets. She moved by instinct, exhaustion gnawing at her edges, but never once did she falter. Thunder boomed again, but it was muffled now, the barn a shield against the wild. Luna stood guard over her foal, eyes fixed on Grace, torn between wildness and trust. Grace slumped onto a bale of hay, heart racing. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, life held on, tenuous, trembling, but real. Grace realized she'd crossed some invisible line tonight, not just as a veterinarian, but as a guardian at the very edge between wildness and hope. And as the foal finally fell asleep, nestled against its mother, Grace whispered a promise to the storm. You made it this far. I won't let you go. The barn was dark except for the soft, golden pool of light spilling from a single hanging bulb above the main stall. The rain hammered the tin roof, a constant drumming that made it almost impossible to tell if it was 2 in the morning or the end of the world. Grace sat on a battered wooden stool near the stall gate, her boots caked in mud, her jeans smeared with streaks of dried blood and rain. She was bone-tired, but her mind would not let her sleep, not while life in its most fragile form depended on her vigilance. Inside the stall, Luna paced in nervous circles, pausing every few turns to nose at her foal. The colt had collapsed into a heap of spindly legs and soft, dun-colored hair, barely strong enough to lift his head. Every now and then, he would shudder, his breathing ragged and uneven. Grace had seen too many foals lose this battle, but she wasn't about to let this one slip away. Not after everything they'd all just survived. She checked the IV line again, making sure it was secure and the drip was steady. The saline solution was doing its job, though she wished for the 100th time she had a full team and a state-of-the-art equine hospital instead of a drafty old barn. But this was Wyoming. Out here, you learned to do the best you could with what you had, and sometimes that had to be enough. Luna's ears flicked back toward Grace, suspicion warring with exhaustion. For wild Mustangs, trust was always in short supply, especially after a night of pain and terror. Grace moved slowly, her hands visible at all times, her voice low and steady. "You're safe now, girl. No one's gonna hurt you here." The mare hesitated, then nuzzled her foal again. Grace saw the old scars along Luna's flank, marks of a hard life on the range, brush with barbed wire, maybe an old mountain lion scrape. This horse had survived things most people never would. And yet, here she was, choosing to stay within arm's reach of a human, if only for her baby's sake. The barn's old clock ticked away the hours as the worst of the storm slowly ebbed. Each time Grace felt her eyelids droop, she forced herself up to check the colt's vitals. Heartbeat fluttery, but present, gums pale but slowly pinking. She massaged the tiny chest when the breathing hitched, whispered encouragements that only the animals heard. Sometime near dawn, Tom reappeared, his hair sticking out from under his hat, eyes heavy with worry. "How's the little one?" he asked, peering over the stall gate. "Still fighting," Grace answered, "but it's close. He's not out of the woods." Tom handed her a steaming mug of coffee, the best kind, strong, burnt, and laced with hope. Grace took a grateful sip, letting the warmth seep into her. "You want me to sit with them for a while? You look like you're about to drop." Grace shook her head. "I'll stay. He needs to hear my voice. And Luna, well, she's not going to trust just anybody yet." Tom nodded, understanding. "Word's out you got a Mustang in your barn," he said quietly. "Dalton called. Said you're harboring his property." Grace snorted, anger flaring beneath her fatigue. "That mare's been wild for years. She's nobody's property, especially not after tonight." Tom looked uneasy. "Just saying. He's not the only rancher watching. People around here don't like it when Mustangs get mixed up with their herds." Grace felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she kept her face calm. "Let them come look. Right now, my job is saving lives. We'll sort out the rest later." Tom gave her shoulder a squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, Grace. Holler if you need me." He left, boots squelching through the puddles. Hours passed in the liminal hush of a barn at night, all storm outside and gentle labor inside. Grace cleaned Luna's wounds again, working slowly to avoid spooking her. She murmured nonsense to the mare, letting her voice fill the quiet. For a long while, Luna watched every move with wild, sharp eyes, but exhaustion wore down her defenses. She let Grace draw nearer than any Mustang should have. When Grace touched her shoulder to bandage a wound, Luna only flinched, did not bolt, did not strike. It was trust, but it was also necessity. The storm, the pain, and the foal had forced them into a fragile alliance. Finally, just as the reins slowed to a gentle patter, the foal lifted his head. Grace's heart leapt. Luna nickered, low and soft. The colt struggled, muscles trembling, and managed to fold his legs beneath him. His head wobbled. Grace held her breath, but he stayed upright, eyes bright for the first time. "That's it, little guy. You show us what you've got," she whispered, a smile cracking through the exhaustion. The first pale fingers of dawn crept through the high barn windows, painting gold across straw and horsehair. Grace let herself lean back against the stall, closing her eyes for a moment. Luna stood guard over her foal, body blocking the world, but when Grace made a move to leave, Luna stepped aside, allowing her a final check before slipping out to let mother and son have a moment together. Grace's heart was full, a wild, strange joy tinged with a deep, gnawing worry. She knew this peace couldn't last, not with ranchers and lawmen soon to come sniffing around. But for now, in the storm's fading echo, she was just grateful for small miracles, for trust born in desperation, for life clawed back from the brink, for a Mustang who chose to stay. Out in the growing light, the prairie looked washed clean, wild, and endless. Grace watched the horizon for a long time, coffee cooling in her hands, and promised herself, whatever storms came next, she'd stand her ground. By the time dawn finally stretched its pale fingers over the horizon, the world outside the barn was transformed. The prairie, once battered and chaotic beneath the storm's fury, now glistened under a gentle, pink-tinged sky. Every blade of grass sparkled with dew, and the air was so crisp it stung Grace's lungs when she stepped out for a moment, boots crunching through wet gravel. In the silence that followed the storm, everything felt fragile, like life itself was holding its breath. Inside, the barn was warmer now, filled with the soft noises of animals coming to life. Chickens began to cluck, horses in the far stalls shuffled and snorted, and the ancient barn cat padded across the rafters, casting an indifferent glance toward the drama in the main stall. Grace, clutching her coffee cup, leaned against the stall door, watching Luna and her newborn. Luna was a picture of fierce motherhood, body still battered, sides streaked with blood and mud, but every muscle alert as she hovered over her colt. The foal was trying to rise, his long legs trembling with the impossible task of standing for the first time. Grace held her breath, barely daring to move. She knew how important these first moments were. Out in the wild, it meant the difference between life and death. The colt's first attempt ended in a tangle of limbs. He flopped back onto the straw, letting out a weak, frustrated squeal. Luna nickered softly, nosing him with encouragement. Grace sipped her coffee, willing him onward. "Come on, little guy. You've made it this far," she whispered. Outside, the world was beginning to stir. A pickup rattled by on the county road, and Grace's dog barked once from the porch. But in the barn, time seemed to slow. Grace moved quietly, checking Luna's wounds again, her hands gentle and methodical. She cleaned a deep scratch on the mare's shoulder, rechecked the IV line for the foal, and tossed fresh straw in the corner. She talked to both mother and colt the whole time, her voice steady and calm, a thread of reassurance that held them together. The foal tried again, this time managing to prop himself on his front knees. He wobbled, nearly overbalancing, but Luna nickered again and nudged him gently. With one great effort, he heaved himself upright, all four legs splayed awkwardly. Grace felt a surge of pride so fierce it surprised her. The colt blinked in the dim light, ears flicking, uncertain but alive. Luna stepped protectively between Grace and her baby. her body a living barrier. But there was something different in her posture. A wariness, yes, but also a strange kind of acceptance. She didn't lash out or bolt. She simply stood her ground, head high, as if daring the world to challenge her right to protect her newborn. Grace finished her coffee and sat quietly on a hay bale, watching. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the high windows, turning the dust motes to gold. She let herself savor this moment, a rare, perfect peace after the long night. She knew it wouldn't last, not with the trouble brewing on the other side of her fence. But for now, it was enough. As the barn warmed, Grace went about her chores. She checked on the other horses, tossed grain for the chickens, and swept the mud from the aisle. Every few minutes, she paused to look in on Luna and the colt, her heart skipping each time she saw the foal standing, nursing awkwardly. Life was fighting its way back, messy, miraculous, and utterly relentless. By mid-morning, the storm's memory had faded, replaced by the soft routine of ranch life. Grace's phone buzzed on the tackroom shelf. Texts from neighbors, a voicemail from the clinic, the world creeping back in. She ignored them for a while, letting herself stay in the quiet sanctuary of the barn. But soon enough, reality knocked at her door. Tom showed up again, carrying a sack of feed and 2 breakfast burritos. "You look like hell," he grinned, handing her one. "Thanks. I feel like it too," Grace replied, smiling in spite of herself. They stood by the stall, eating in companionable silence, watching the mare and her colt. "You did good last night, Whitaker," Tom said softly, voice thick with respect. "Not many would have risked it." Grace shrugged, suddenly embarrassed by the praise. "It wasn't just me. Luna did the hard part." Tom laughed. "She's a tough one, all right. Gonna be even tougher when Dalton comes sniffing around." Grace's jaw tightened. The name sent a ripple of anxiety through her piece. "He can wait. They need time." Tom nodded, but Grace saw the worry in his eyes. "Just be careful, Grace. Folks talk." After Tom left, Grace sat alone for a long while, turning the words over in her mind. She knew what was coming. Legal threats, angry neighbors, maybe even a showdown if Dalton decided to take matters into his own hands. But looking at Luna, standing over her newborn with the wild world just beyond the barn door, Grace felt something settle inside her. She was needed here. Not just as a vet, but as a protector, a witness to the hard miracles that happened on the edge of survival. When the colt nuzzled his mother and nursed for the first time, Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She hadn't felt this kind of purpose in years. Not since she'd lost her own family. Not since she'd chosen the hard, lonely life out here on the range. Now, for the first time in a long while, she felt whole. There was work to be done, and she was exactly where she needed to be. She stroked Luna's neck, careful and slow, whispering, "You're safe, girl, I promise." Luna's ears flicked, but she didn't move away. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. Outside, the day grew brighter. The prairie glowed with possibility. Grace finished her coffee and stood, already planning what needed to be done. Supplies to fetch, calls to make, fences to mend. But for now, she let herself linger in the barn's hush, grateful for the rare gift of a morning where life had won. She didn't know how long this peace would last, but she vowed to protect it with everything she had. The day wore on, sunlight streaming through the barn windows as the prairie shimmered under a rare, cloudless sky. Grace moved through her morning in a kind of trance, checking Luna's wounds, making sure the colt was nursing and steady on his long, awkward legs. She fed the other horses, let the dog out for a run, even found time to brew a fresh pot of coffee. But beneath every simple act, a slow-burning anxiety worked its way through her thoughts. She knew the peace wouldn't last. Word traveled fast in Wyoming ranch country. Even before lunch, Grace noticed more pickups rolling past her property than usual. One stopped, the driver pretending to check his phone while eyeing her barn. Another slowed to wave, a friendly gesture, but the curiosity in the glance was sharp. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed with a text from an old friend in town. "You got a wild mare in the barn? Careful, Dalton's on the warpath." Grace set her jaw. She'd been expecting this. She was no stranger to small-town politics, or the way old grudges could flare up over something as simple as a fence line. But this was different. This time it was about Luna, about a life she'd fought for in the dark and the rain. Just after noon, the crunch of tires on gravel announced what she already knew was coming. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her jeans as a big silver pickup swung into her drive. Mr. Dalton climbed out, hat low over his eyes, boots already stained with dust. Two of his hired hands stayed in the truck, staring out at the pasture. Dalton was all business. Hard angles, weathered face, a voice honed by years of barking orders. "Morning, Dr. Whitaker," he called, striding up with a stiff, practiced friendliness that didn't fool her for a second. "Morning, Dalton. Something I can help you with?" Grace kept her tone neutral, but made no move to invite him in. Dalton jerked a thumb toward the barn. "Hear you got one of my mares holed up in there. Luna, she's called. Been running with my herd for years now, branded and everything." Grace folded her arms, meeting his gaze. "She's a wild Mustang, always has been. She came onto my land last night, tangled in barbed wire, giving birth. You know the storm. I did what any vet would do." Dalton's lips tightened. "That horse has my mark on her flank. Look for yourself. Just because she's gone wild don't mean she's not mine. Under Wyoming open-range law, she's fair game, and so's that foal." Grace felt a flare of anger. "With all due respect, that mare's been living free for years. She's only here because she nearly died. You want to talk brands? I saw yours. Faded, old, almost grown over with scar tissue. She hasn't been on your books for a long time." Dalton stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Don't get smart, Grace. I'm not here for a fight. Just want what's mine. Law also says you can't just walk in and haul away an injured animal from my care. She's in critical condition, and so's her foal. They won't survive another move today." Grace held his gaze unblinking. Dalton scowled, looking past her at the barn as if he could see right through the doors. "I'm not asking for a fight. I'm telling you how things stand. You keep that mare, I'll have to call the sheriff. You know how the law falls around here. I don't want trouble, Grace, but I won't let you claim my stock." Tension simmered in the air. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the dry prairie grass, the distant call of a hawk overhead. Grace could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her stance calm and open. She'd dealt with men like Dalton before, hard, proud, unable to back down. She decided to try a different tack. "Look, I'm not looking to steal from you, but Luna's got a foal barely 12 hours old. The colt's weak. You try to move them now and you could lose them both. Let me do my job, get them through the worst, and then we'll sort out what's fair. You can have your lawyer call mine if you want. But for now, they're staying here." Dalton bristled, jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he might say something harsher, but instead he just spat into the dust. "You think you're some kind of hero, Whitaker. This isn't about you, it's about what's right. I'll give you until tomorrow morning. After that, I'm coming back, and I won't be alone." He turned and walked back to his truck, the hired hands smirking as they drove off. Grace watched them go, heart racing. She knew what tomorrow would bring. Dalton, maybe some of his neighbors, possibly the sheriff. She'd seen these standoffs before, and they rarely ended cleanly. She went back inside, checked on Luna and the foal. Luna was restless, picking up on the tension. Grace knelt, stroking the mare's neck, whispering softly, "Don't worry, girl. I'm not giving you up without a fight." The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and phone calls. Grace rang the sheriff's office, left a message about the situation. She called a friend at the Bureau of Land Management, hoping for backup. She even considered calling a reporter in town, someone who'd written about wild horse disputes before. Anything to keep things from boiling over. As the sun dipped low, painting the fields with gold, Grace sat in the barn and watched Luna and her foal. The colt had found his legs, wobbling around the stall with growing confidence. Luna kept close, ever watchful. Grace felt a wave of protectiveness, a certainty that she was doing the right thing, no matter how hard it might get. But she couldn't shake the sense of dread, the knowledge that this fragile peace was hanging by a thread. Outside, the prairie was quiet, but Grace knew the storm wasn't over. It was only changing shape. She stood, rolling her stiff shoulders, and made a silent promise to Luna and her colt. "I'll stand with you, whatever comes." Night fell, and Grace locked the barn tight, preparing for the next battle. One fought not against nature, but against old grudges and the rules of men. Morning always came fast after a sleepless night, and Grace Whitaker's heart was already pounding before the sun even cleared the horizon. She had barely managed an hour's rest, curled on a cot in the feed room with her boots on, an old blanket thrown over her shoulders, and the shotgun within arm's reach. Not that she wanted to use it, but just knowing it was there made her feel less helpless. Every time she drifted off, nightmares of Dalton's truck rumbling up the drive jolted her awake. At dawn, the barn was filled with golden light. Luna stood protectively over her colt, ears flicking at every sound. The foal was brighter this morning, up on his feet, wobbly but determined, suckling with a strength that made Grace's tired heart swell with hope. Grace crouched beside them, whispering encouragement, her eyes stinging from exhaustion and worry. Then, just as she finished checking the bandage on Luna's hind leg, the distant rumble of engines shattered the peace. She froze. Luna's ears shot up, the foal pressed close to his mother's side. Grace stepped into the barn aisle, squinting toward the driveway. Sure enough, Dalton's silver truck led the way, headlights glaring even in the early light. Behind him rolled two more pickups, one belonging to the sheriff's office, the other with the stenciled logo of the Bureau of Land Management on the door. Dalton had not come alone. She felt a flicker of gratitude mixed with dread. At least the law was here. Maybe that meant this wouldn't end in threats and shouting. Dalton climbed out first, his face set in hard lines, eyes steely. He had 3 ranch hands with him today, big men in boots and Carhartt jackets, arms crossed over their chests. The sheriff, a woman named Marnie Keller, emerged from her cruiser and strolled over with a measured calm that only seasoned law enforcement seemed to possess. Last out was a tall, sunburned man in a BLM vest, clipboard tucked under his arm. Grace squared her shoulders, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked out to meet them. She kept her voice steady as she greeted the sheriff. "Morning, Marnie." "Morning, Grace." Keller nodded, her gaze flicking to Dalton and then back to Grace. "Mind telling me what we're all doing here at sunrise?" Dalton didn't wait for an invitation. "I told you yesterday, Sheriff. She's got one of my mares, branded, and now with a foal. That horse belongs on my range. The law's clear. Grace didn't flinch. She's not your property, Dalton. Not anymore. She's been wild for years, barely even has your old brand left. Last night she nearly died giving birth in my pasture. I saved her and her foal. They're still not out of danger. If you try to move them now, it could kill them both. Dalton's jaw clenched. That's not your call. The BLM agent stepped forward. I'm Ted Mason, Bureau of Land Management. We've had reports of wild horse disputes in this area before. Dr. Whitaker, can I see the animals? Grace nodded, leading the group into the barn. Luna and her foal shrank back, the mare's body tense as a drawn bow. Dalton made a move as if to grab the halter hanging nearby, but Grace shot him a look that stopped him cold. Ted examined the mare, running gentle hands over her side, noting the faded brand and the fresh wounds. She's definitely been wild for a while, he said quietly, glancing at Grace. These aren't the injuries of a recently kept animal. Keller looked from Grace to Dalton. Legally, she was branded. Once. But open-range law is gray on animals gone feral this long, especially after a foal's born wild. Dalton bristled. Are you telling me I'm out of luck? That woman stole my horse? Grace cut in, her voice trembling with anger. I didn't steal anything, Dalton. I patched up a dying animal on my own land, in the middle of a storm. If you'd wanted her so bad, maybe you should have kept a better eye on her. She chose the wild. The barn grew quiet. Even the ranch hands shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. For a moment, Grace thought Dalton might try to push past her anyway, but Marnie Keller stepped in front of him, hand resting casually near her belt. No one's hauling any animal out of here this morning. Ted? Ted nodded. I'm going to recommend we place the mare and her foal in Dr. Whitaker's care for now. We'll need to sort out ownership and health. I'll file an official review. Dalton exploded. You can't do this. The sheriff's tone sharpened. I can, and I will. If you want to contest it, you take it up in court. But for now, you're not taking that mare off this property without a judge's order. Understood? Dalton glared, his face mottled with rage, but he knew when he was beaten, at least for today. He spat in the straw, muttered something under his breath, and stomped back toward his truck. His men followed, silent now, looking more uncertain than before. Ted gave Grace a tired smile. You did good work. Keep the BLM posted on her condition. We'll check in again soon. As the trucks pulled away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the muddy driveway, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees shook with relief and leftover adrenaline. She turned back to the barn, finding Luna watching her with wild, wary eyes, her colt pressed close against her side. Marnie lingered. You all right? Grace managed a weak smile. Ask me again tomorrow. The sheriff squeezed her shoulder. Don't let Dalton rattle you. You did the right thing, Grace. The whole county knows it, whether they'll admit it or not. After everyone was gone, Grace slumped onto a hay bale in the barn aisle. Luna's breathing calmed. The foal finally drifted into sleep. Grace ran a hand through her tangled hair, exhausted but fierce with relief. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more paperwork, more visits, maybe even a lawsuit. But for now, Luna and her baby were safe. That night, as dusk crept in, Grace watched the prairie from her porch, watching storm clouds gather again on the distant hills. But in her heart, she felt stronger. She'd stood her ground. She'd defended what was right. Inside the barn, Luna nickered softly, the foal's tiny whinny rising in answer. Grace smiled, a little bit of hope flickering back to life. Whatever the future held, she would face it, one storm, one sunrise at a time. With the standoff behind her, Grace thought the worst was over, But the days that followed revealed a new kind of tension, one built on bureaucracy, paperwork, and the constant presence of watchful eyes. The barn, which had been a sanctuary in the storm, became something closer to a quarantine ward and a courtroom all in one. The line between sanctuary and holding pen was thin as a strand of barbed wire. BLM agent Ted Mason came by every morning, clipboard in hand, recording Luna's progress and inspecting the foal's growing strength. He checked the faded brand on Luna's flank, took photos, and asked the same questions day after day. Is she eating well? Any sign of infection? How's her temperament? Grace answered with the patience of a teacher and the stubbornness of someone who knew she was right. She documented everything, every temperature, every wound cleaned, every time Luna nursed her colt or kicked at the stall door. Other visitors came too. A deputy from the sheriff's office stopped by with official forms, apologizing for the trouble but insisting everything be done by the book. A representative from Dalton's attorney called, leaving messages on Grace's phone, reminding her that the legal status of Luna and the foal was still in question. Each night, Grace filled out logs, took photos of Luna's healing wounds, and sent updates to the BLM and the sheriff's office. Each morning she worried, what if something goes wrong on my watch? Meanwhile, Grace's reputation, once her shield in the county, became a double-edged sword. Neighbors stopped by, some bringing casseroles or fresh coffee, others only thinly disguising their curiosity as concern. Heard you're running a wild horse rescue now, one said, half joking, half accusing. Others whispered about Dalton, about old grudges and the tangled history of ranchers and wild horses in these hills. The little town's Facebook group buzzed with speculation, and Grace's phone buzzed with texts. Hang in there, Grace. You need help. Just holler. Dalton's lawyer's a snake. Watch your back. In the barn, the atmosphere was calmer, though not without its own trials. Luna was restless at first, skittish whenever a stranger approached. Even Grace's quiet presence sometimes sent the mare circling her stall, eyes white, nostrils flared. The foal, dubbed Lucky by Grace and Tom, who stopped by daily to help, grew stronger, exploring the stall and testing his legs. Each time Grace approached to change a bandage or check the IV, Luna would tense. But as the days wore on, she relaxed, if only a little, allowing Grace to touch her flank without shying away. One night, as wind rattled the windows and a cold rain tapped the tin roof, Grace sat in the barn long after midnight, logs and vet supplies strewn around her. Lucky slept curled beside his mother, the picture of peace. Luna watched Grace, ears forward, alert but not afraid. You know, Grace murmured, voice soft in the hush. It's strange to think your life comes down to paperwork and meetings when it should just be about grass and sky. She felt the weight of every form she'd filed, every phone call, every lingering doubt. But you and that colt are safe for now, I promise. As the week wore on, officials came and went, measuring, checking, debating. One afternoon, BLM's Ted brought a colleague, an older woman with a hawk's gaze. She watched Luna and Lucky in silence, making notes in a small black notebook. Afterward, she pulled Grace aside. You've done good work here, Dr. Whitaker, but don't get too attached. Decisions like this, they get made at desks, not barns. Grace nodded, jaw tight, but inside her chest, something bristled. She watched the mare nuzzle her foal, felt a fierce protectiveness she couldn't put into words. The official review dragged on. Dalton's lawyer sent letters. Social media rumbled with opinions. The sheriff's deputy checked in every other day, friendly but careful to remind Grace of the temporary nature of her custody. Still, Grace clung to routine. Early mornings cleaning wounds, tracking Luna's temperature, weighing Lucky, walking the barn at dusk and pausing always to speak softly to her unexpected guests. Tom became her anchor, bringing news from town and sometimes a warm pie from his wife. One evening, as they sat on the barn step watching the sun set pink and gold over the hills, he asked, "You ever think you'd be in the middle of something like this?" Grace laughed, a real laugh for the first time in days. "Not in 100 years, but I wouldn't trade it, not for anything." The BLM's final inspection came at the end of the week. Ted, clipboard in hand, watched Luna and Lucky trot around the small corral Grace had set up behind the barn. The foal was bright-eyed, cantering awkwardly, his mother a steady, watchful shadow. "Well," Ted said finally, "they look good. You've done all anyone could." "Is that your way of saying it's over?" Grace asked. Ted shrugged, almost sheepish. "Not quite, but I'll be recommending release. You'll get official word in the morning." Grace watched as Ted's truck disappeared down the drive. The weight in her chest lifted just a little. That night, as she closed up the barn and watched the Mustang pair settle under the pale light, she felt both victory and the ache of impending loss. Luna, once wild and wary, now watched her not with fear, but with something closer to understanding. Lucky's tiny whinny broke the quiet as he nuzzled his mother and settled in the straw. Grace stood at the barn door, looking out across the moonlit prairie, and realized that sanctuary comes in many forms. Sometimes it was a safe barn after a storm. Sometimes it was the small miracle of a wild mare allowing you close. And sometimes it was the bittersweet knowledge that letting go was the hardest and bravest act of all. The official word came at dawn as Grace stood outside the barn with a mug of coffee cooling in her hands, watching the prairie come alive in soft gold and silver light. The email was brief, almost cold after all she'd poured into the last week. BLM recommends release of mare and foal to the open range. Please coordinate with Agent Mason for boundary transfer at earliest convenience. Thank you for your cooperation, Dr. Whitaker. Grace read it twice, her eyes lingering on release, the word both a relief and a heartbreak. She'd known this day was coming. She'd promised herself she wouldn't hold on, that she'd do what was best for Luna and Lucky, even if it meant saying goodbye. But as the sun crested the distant ridge, painting the sky with wild colors, her heart ached. Every moment of care, every whispered word in the barn, every battle fought for these two lives, they'd woven themselves into the quiet corners of her soul. She spent the morning in ritual, as if preparing for a ceremony. She checked Luna's wounds one last time, found them healing into tough, proud scars. She brushed the mare's tangled mane, murmuring thanks for every second Luna had allowed her touch. She wrapped Lucky in a fresh blanket for the dawn chill, and laughed as he nipped playfully at her sleeve, full of new strength and curiosity. Luna watched, still and silent, her wild eyes softer than Grace had ever seen. Ted Mason arrived as the first meadowlarks called, carrying the same clipboard but leaving it in the truck. "You ready?" he asked gently. Grace nodded, though her throat felt tight. "They are." Together, they led Luna and Lucky out of the barn, down the narrow path to the back gate where Grace's property met the federal range. The prairie was wide open, endless grass waving under the morning breeze, fence posts vanishing into forever. It was the kind of wild space that could swallow up pain and memory, that gave birth to legends and let them slip quietly away. At the gate, Grace paused. Luna stood at her side, head high, every muscle tensed with anticipation. Lucky danced on spindly legs, darting forward and then back, his energy infectious. Ted opened the gate, swinging it wide, He nodded to Grace, who knelt and unhooked the foal's halter. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Luna just watched her, eyes dark and searching. Grace reached out, palm open, not to restrain, but to offer a final moment of trust. "Go on, girl," she whispered. "This world is yours." Luna stepped forward, pausing with her nose just inches from Grace's hand. She lingered, nostrils flaring, breathing in the scent of the woman who'd fought for her life. Grace fought the tears, forcing herself to smile, to stand tall for the mare and the colt. Lucky nuzzled at his mother, uncertain. A single shuddering breath passed between them, a silent promise, a memory carved into dawn. Then Luna gave a low nicker and nudged her foal toward the open range. Lucky bounded past, tail flicking with wild excitement. Grace watched them slip through the gate, their shadows long on the sunlit grass. Luna paused on the other side, turning to look back. Her mane lifted in the breeze, her scars bright and proud beneath the rising sun. For a second, the world held its breath. Then, with a final toss of her head, she trotted out, Lucky at her side, into the freedom that had always been hers. Grace stood unmoving, hands clenched at her sides. Ted watched in silence, giving her space. "You did right by them," he said quietly after a long moment. "Not everyone would have let go." Grace swallowed, feeling the ache settle deep inside her chest. "It was never about keeping them," she replied. "It was about giving them a chance. Sometimes that means stepping aside, even when every part of you wants to hold on." Ted nodded, understanding in his weathered eyes. "Doesn't make it any easier." Grace watched the pair fade into the endless grass. Two wild shapes against a wild sky. For a moment, the emptiness seemed too much to bear. A barn now quiet, a corral suddenly still, her hands empty after so many days of constant care. She turned back, passing through the gate and latching it behind her. Each step felt heavy, but there was also relief, a sense that she had kept her promise, that she had honored the wildness in Luna and the hope in Lucky. The barn felt different that afternoon, hollow, echoing with memories of soft whinnies and the steady beat of new life. Grace cleaned up with methodical care, scrubbing buckets and folding blankets, putting away the tools that had become extensions of herself. She found one of Lucky's tufts of baby hair caught in a brush and tucked it into her pocket, a small, wild souvenir. Neighbors called, some curious, some kind. Tom stopped by, bringing fresh bread and a six-pack, wordless in his support. They sat on the porch together, watching the prairie for any sign of Luna and her colt. For hours they saw nothing but wind and grass and a sky so big it made everything else feel small. As dusk fell, Grace found herself standing by the fence, staring into the fading light. She whispered a blessing to the wind, a hope for Luna's strength, for Lucky's wild heart, for every animal whose life crossed hers. In the end, freedom was the greatest gift she could give, even if it broke her heart a little. She knew she'd do it all again, that the work of healing was as much about letting go as it was about holding on. That night, sleep came slow but deep. In her dreams, she saw Luna and Lucky running free beneath the stars, their hoofbeats part of the heartbeat of the land. The morning after Luna and Lucky vanished over the ridge, Grace's world seemed quieter, both inside and out. The barn was almost too clean, her hands too idle. No more pre-dawn checks, no more whispered reassurances in the darkness. Grace lingered in the empty stall, running her fingers through the straw where the colt had slept, feeling the bittersweet ache of absence. In the old rhythm of ranch life, work always waited. Horses to feed, fences to walk, bills to pay. But something in Grace was changed. That afternoon, the local radio host, Millie Hart, called. Millie ran a segment called Voices from the Valley. Half local news, half therapy for a county scattered thin across hundreds of square miles. "Heard there was quite a story out at your place last week, Doc," Millie said, her voice equal parts curiosity and warmth. "How about sharing it with the rest of us? We could use a little good news, and maybe a lesson or two." Grace hesitated. She'd never liked the spotlight, but something in her longed to talk about what happened, if only to make sense of it herself. "All right, Millie," she agreed. "Come on by." They met in the shade of Grace's front porch, a battered recorder between them and mugs of strong coffee in hand. Millie asked gentle questions, coaxing out the story, the wild storm, the rescue, the sleepless nights, the legal wrangling, and the final, wrenching release. As Grace talked, her words fell into the wind, carried across the open land like a prayer. "So what did you learn, Dr. Whitaker?" Millie asked, recorder humming quietly. "What's the takeaway for the rest of us?" Grace watched a cloud drift across the horizon, her heart still full of ache and pride. She thought about all the things she'd learned. Not just about horses, but about herself, about hope, and about letting go. "Healing doesn't mean holding on tight," Grace said softly, voice steady. "Sometimes it means doing everything you can, and then letting go. Luna's trust. It was never mine to keep. It was a gift I had to return." Millie nodded, eyes kind. "That's a hard lesson. Most folks want to fix things, keep them close, make sure nothing bad happens." Grace smiled, sadness and strength mingling in her eyes. "We all want that. But wild things, they need room to choose. And sometimes, the best you can do is make their world a little safer while they're with you, and then wish them well when they go." Millie's next question was softer. "Do you regret any of it?" Grace shook her head, a little laugh escaping. "Not for a second. I'd do it all again, even knowing how much it would hurt. Because what's the point of being here, of being a vet or a neighbor or just a person, if you don't risk your heart sometimes? We think we're in control, but really, we're just witnesses. We get to help, to hope, to fight for what matters. But the wild, real life, it goes on, whether we hold on or not." The interview ended as the sun slid lower, the porch bathed in honey light. Millie packed up, promising to edit the story for tomorrow's show. Grace listened the next day, nerves jangling as her own voice filled the kitchen. Raw, honest, maybe even a little wise. Afterward, her phone buzzed with messages from strangers and friends alike. Some thanked her, some said they'd cried. One older rancher left a message that simply said, "Didn't know you had it in you, Whitaker. Proud to call you neighbor." The days moved forward, but the lesson lingered. Grace carried it into her work with every animal she touched. An orphaned lamb, a stray dog, an old gelding nearing the end. She found herself less afraid of goodbyes, more willing to risk loving even when loss was certain. And she talked about Luna and Lucky, not as a loss, but as proof of what mattered. Kindness, courage, the quiet strength to step back when the time was right. One morning, while mending the back fence, Grace met a young girl on horseback, Jessie Dalton, Mr. Dalton's granddaughter. The girl looked nervous, clutching the reins tight. "Grandpa said to say thank you," she blurted, cheeks red. "He's still mad, but he said you did right. I think so too." Grace smiled, feeling the sharp edge of old conflict dull just a bit. "Tell your grandpa I appreciate it. And if you ever see Luna out there, tell her I said hello." Jessie grinned and rode off, the small gesture mending more than just fences. That evening, Grace sat on her porch, notebook in hand, trying to capture the shape of her thoughts. She wrote about storms and wild things, about how the hardest work wasn't just in healing wounds, but in respecting the boundaries of every soul, animal or human. She wrote about freedom and love, about the grace it took to do the right thing, even when it hurt. As the sky darkened and the prairie wind swept over the hills, Grace realized she was changed, her heart widened by the wild. She understood now. Some gifts aren't meant to be kept, only cherished as long as you're lucky enough to hold them. The summer rolled on, the prairie turning gold and wildflowers painting the hills as if nature itself was trying to celebrate survival. For Grace Whitaker, life fell back into familiar rhythms. Early mornings in the barn, long afternoons riding the fence line, house calls to neighbors with sick calves or aging pets. Yet something inside her had shifted. There was a quiet strength, a patience born from the storm, and the knowledge that the most important things in life are never truly tamed. Some days, Grace found herself standing at the edge of her pasture, eyes searching the horizon for a flicker of movement, a flash of silver in the distance. Each sunrise brought with it the possibility that she might see Luna and Lucky again, free, strong, forever part of the Wyoming wild. Sometimes, at sunset, she thought she saw them, two silhouettes on the far ridge, one tall and proud, the other young and full of restless energy. It could have been any Mustangs, but Grace always smiled, believing it was them. News of Grace's stand for the Mustangs traveled quietly through the valley, reshaping the way people saw her. Some neighbors called her stubborn, others called her a hero. Most simply nodded in understanding, as if they too carried the memory of wild things inside them. Dalton kept his distance, the feud between them softened by time and Jesse's brave thank you. Sometimes Grace wondered if the old rancher, alone on his porch, looked out at the same ridges and hoped for a glimpse of the wild mare he once claimed. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the sky turned to fire, Grace's porch became a gathering place. Tom stopped by, guitar slung over his shoulder. He played old songs while Grace handed out lemonade and listened to the laughter drifting up from the yard. The townspeople, some shy, some boisterous, all changed in small ways by the story of the wild mare, shared tales of storms and hard choices, of things lost and found on the Wyoming prairie. They spoke about Luna and Lucky, but also about every hard-won freedom, every act of compassion that had made their lives richer, if not always easier. Later, when the crowd faded and dusk wrapped the house in peace, Grace wandered down to the barn. The old building was quiet, smelling of hay and memory. She traced her fingers along the stall where Luna and her foal had spent their brief sanctuary, thinking about everything that had happened. There were scars in the wood, bits of Lucky's mane caught on the boards, and a feeling that something important lingered in the air. Something wild and gentle, untamable but never forgotten. On the first cool night of September, Grace walked out alone to the edge of her land, guided by the moon and the longing in her heart. The world was silent except for the wind in the grass and the distant call of coyotes. She stood still, letting the night wrap around her, and listened, not for hoofbeats, but for the lesson the wild had given her. She realized then that true connection wasn't about holding on. It was about respect. It was about fighting for the right of every creature, horse or human, to live on their own terms, to be protected and, when the time came, released. Love, the brave kind, was never about possession. It was about defending freedom, even if it meant you had to stand alone in the storm. Grace closed her eyes, letting herself feel the ache and the pride mingling in her chest. She remembered the moment Luna lingered at the open gate, the pause, the nudge, the choice. That memory, brighter than any scar, would live inside her always. Weeks later, she found herself on a local podcast, telling her story again for a wider audience. The host asked what she would tell others who faced impossible choices or felt powerless against the wild forces of their own lives. Grace's answer was simple. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is fight for something you'll never get to keep. Sometimes, love means stepping back and letting go. If you're lucky, you get to watch what you've helped heal run free. The host paused, moved by the truth in her words. Messages from listeners poured in over the next days. Letters from young people inspired to volunteer, from ranchers who promised to look differently at the Mustangs grazing beyond their fences, from old friends who remembered the stubborn, lonely girl who'd grown into the valley's quiet champion. And so, life went on. Storms came and went. Horses were born and grew wild. Some people stayed, some moved on. But on the days when the prairie was golden and the sky impossibly wide, Grace would catch a glimpse of two shapes on the distant hills, a wild mare and her colt, forever part of the story she'd been lucky enough to share. She stood on her porch at sunset, the same way she had on that first night, watching the far hills and feeling gratitude that ran deeper than words. In the hush between daylight and darkness, with the scent of sage and earth in the air, she knew that some hearts are meant to roam free, and that the best we can do is meet them with open hands, a strong heart, and the promise to remember. Sometimes, the wildest things we touch leave us changed forever, and sometimes, the bravest love is the kind that lets go, trusting that what you give away will return to the world stronger, wilder, and never forgotten.